Hey everyone, wanted to do a new show for you guys today. Basically, it's going to be a new style of content that's going to be in parallel, of course, to the rest of our content, but it's basically our commentary content type, and we're going to be basically discussing major topics that are going on in the world today, wrapped around freedom, wrapped around decentralization and the technology that, of course, that empowers freedom, and other current events that are related to this type of ecosystem that's impactful to the things we're doing. So I wanted to share with you guys an article that came across my Twitter feed today. It's a follow-up article to another one that I had seen in the past and that I thought was really good from this gentleman named Stephen Paley. And he'd done another article in the past, which was basically how to sue a DAO, which I thought was pretty interesting. We'll actually probably do another show on that particular one because I think that article is very interesting, and there's some ways we can evolve that conversation as well. But this one is kind of a follow-up, and I think more of a broader thought process behind what is the impacts of law on smart contracts and the impacts of law on decentralized software and organizations potentially wrapped around that type of software, like a DAO, right? So a decentralized autonomous organization. So I thought it'd be interesting to go into this article and highlight some of the key things that were more impactful, and then talk about how we can probably evolve the thinking in some of these areas. So this is commentary episode 1. So let us know if you like this content type, if there's articles out there that you would like us to actually produce or comment on, or kind of build a deeper conversation around. And then also I'd love to take the next step and interview everyone we have comments on, so that they can give us a deeper understanding of their thoughts, and we can kind of potentially go back and forth on where some of this could go. So now I'm going to get into the specifics of this article. Again, this is Smart Contracts, Performance, and Trust. You can be found on Medium. The link is the second bullet. We'll, of course, also put the links below the video so that you guys can use it, link it, read it, read it yourself. I think it's a great article, so please do read it yourself. It's good to understand the entire impacts, and also good to understand the thinking of someone like Mr. Paley, who is pretty well adept at crypto technologies in terms of at least understanding them, as well as how that impacts law today and how law impacts crypto technologies, right? So it's good to understand the thinking, and it's good to understand where he's coming from, and then hopefully I can shed some light on how we can evolve some of this thinking as well. He's done some other work, which is also in these bullets below here. We'll, of course, provide this PowerPoint and all the links and all the content, of course, open source. And again, when I say open source, at least this applies to this show and a lot of things that will be coming out of the show. It's completely free. There is no tertiary impacts of saying the word free. It's freely available to you. You do what you want with. We're not actually licensing any of this in a structural way. You guys do what you want, right? So anyway, we'll get into the actual content and some of the thoughts here. So the gist of his article is basically that trust is a human concept, right? That trust exists because two humans are interacting, and two or more, right? Really, and the idea is that will never go away, no matter what technology you apply. And he's right in that sense. And we'll go into kind of the meat of this, but I wanted to do a quick overview. He's right in that sense, but where I think he's missing kind of the technological impacts of all of this is that there is no right or wrong. There is only what the software does, right? So when you build a piece of code, the code is going to do what the code was defined to do. It's just, it gets, translated into bytecode. It gets, pushed through a hardware abstraction layer, back down to the CPU, becomes ones and zeros, and it just does what the code does, right? So there really is none of this concept of trust or malleability or anything of that nature. Now, you could argue that the code being affected by other people or impacted by network effects in terms of actual like packet manipulation and transmutation and shaping and all these other stuff, you could potentially affect the system that is built, and you could potentially see new code and all this other stuff. So there's a lot of more technical impacts that could happen that you could argue break the original definition of what the system was supposed to do. However, the whole point is that when we build these pieces of software, especially when we build smart contracts and new decentralized technologies and all these other components, it's really the reality is there's always this disclaimer, right? It's just like, yeah, it's going to work so long as all these other variables are true, right? So you, as the user, take on the burden of risk. And the beautiful part there is that it allows you to trust the software to the extent of it will do its intended purpose. But if an anomaly happens or some sort of tertiary impact comes to be, like a bug, an anomaly being a bug, or a tertiary impact being like a DDoS or something like that that's happening, some sort of denial of service, then you just understand the expectations that's the risk, right, of that ecosystem. It's like driving a car. We expect the car to basically do its functions, to turn left and right, to go forward and reverse, but we understand that things fail. It's just an immutable law of friction and heat and all this other stuff, right? And so the point here is that as we start to build technologies and these new software that potentially act and exist as if they're organizations, like Bitcoin is a great example that people are intimately familiar with. It's really super tangible, right? You can go buy Bitcoin. You play with Bitcoin. It's the first decentralized autonomous organization. Now it's in its infancy, right? It's basically a bunch of code, right, that's running autonomously on one or many nodes, right, that interact with each other and provides a very valuable function. And it's obviously market tested, it's revenue tested, it's battle tested, as we say in the industry. The whole idea is that that tangible implementation is a perfect representation of people not having to trust anything, right? You don't have to trust the people who built it. You don't have to trust the people who use it. You just have to trust in the math, and the math is immutable, right? And so the whole point here that he goes into is all of the more complex scenarios, right, that could arise in organizations, potentially like DAO, and we'll get into some of those concepts as we go along. But the reality is as you start to build these types of systems, you actually disaggregate or decentralize each component. So there's this concept called service-oriented architecture in old enterprise kind of nomenclature, right? So a while back, I think it was the late 80s, early 90s or whatever, there's this concept of basically building a service that does one thing, does it really well, and that's all it does, right? That's it. And something like, it would actually be even less complex technically than Bitcoin in of itself as a vertical slice. It would be maybe something akin to the peer-to-peer communications layer of Bitcoin would be a service in and of itself. And then on top of that, you would layer an application like Bitcoin on top of that, etc. So the concept is that as we start to run into the potential barriers where we have more complex problems, let's say something as complex as a conglomerate DAO, right? Something like the DAO that's being built by Slockit and put out in the marketplace, and where you could have multitude of vendors and you could have multitude of potential implications and performance things that come up in contracts, etc., which is one of the key things it gets into. Then what happens is you no longer, as we start to build up this ecosystem, you no longer go after vendors who are going to do something ambiguous. You're going to go after a service that has performed well in the past and just does what it does, right? And to be fair, there is this timeline of chicken and the egg, right? Well, I mean, yeah, in order to do bigger, bolder experiments or bigger types of organizations like the DAO, you're going to need to start to build a framework, right? And the groundwork for all that, and there's going to be a lot of pain. But the investors who are investing in that understand the risk. They invest in that risk. They choose that risk, etc. So it's really not a legal issue anymore. It's a choice, right? And one of the key things I think we'll showcase throughout this article and through the commentary is that, combined with the fact that you have an atomic unit that's a given service, it does one thing, does it really well, and you combine that with a voluntary choice that you're taking on, then there really is no legal impact, right? So you're just choosing a service, and that service is certainly going to perform to how it's defined, and then it ends. And it's all going to be autonomous and automated. So there is going to be no other humans involved in these services as they start to mature. And Bitcoin's a perfect example of that. There's plenty of other perfect examples. The DAO is itself, in of itself, is a smart contract, is another example of that. And so we'll continue to go through a number of these examples. But let's delve deeper in the article. That's kind of the intro and the premise and some of the thoughts around it. But we're going to go into some supporting thoughts, both on his side in terms of where he sees it, and we'll go into some supporting thoughts on where I think the reality is, right? So one of the things he mentions here is, basically blockchain-based platforms are touted as removing the need for human trust from transactions. And then he goes into traditional contracts, we're told, can't be trusted. Cryptographically secure peer-to-peer platforms make trust moot, and guarantee performance. That's the claim, right? And so he goes on to kind of contradict that claim in the sense of, as I mentioned earlier, that humans are really involved and there's a kind of a bunch of orthogonal type of problems, and then things get really complex in reality, etc. Because he's used to doing things in the existing system, right? The existing legal system, the existing enterprise system, where there is lots of those issues, right? Anyway, so he goes into. He actually makes an interesting comment here around how are old-fashioned contracts handled, blah blah blah. He goes into kind of kind of how they function, and goes into jurisdiction, all this stuff, and then he makes this really interesting comment. He says, "But a 7-year-old can't generally form a contract." Now he uses the word "generally" to try to use it as an escape clause because he knows what's coming next. Well, if a 7-year-old can't agree to a contract, well, then he can't agree to ice cream, and he can't agree to the food that, or sitting down and playing with his toys. He can't agree to a negotiation between him and his parents, etc., which is absurd. Now, also absurd, we wouldn't expect a 7-year-old to agree to some sort of multi-billion-dollar contract, right? He doesn't have the experience, he doesn't have the knowledge, he's not biologically fully formed, etc. So, but he is still agreeing to contract, and he almost contradicts himself in the second sentence, literally right after that. It says a contract can be confirmed by a handshake, though some will say it defeats the purpose, and not all contracts can be verbal. And so the point here is that, yes, there's varying degrees of contracts, and there's varying degrees of aptitude in which the parties engage in these contracts. And it could be something as simple as agreeing to go to bed as a 7-year-old, agreeing to that contract, or it could be something as complex as a multi-billion-dollar organization entering into a merger and acquisition type scenario where they're buying assets and there's a multitude of contracts involved, etc. Right? So anyway, the whole point is there are vagaries. There's varying degrees, like many things in life, right, around contracts. And it's not that the immutable properties of a contract changes. It's that our understanding of trust, as he says it, and the ability to provide trust would be on a sliding scale based on parameters. Like if I'm a 7-year-old, again, I'm not going to ascribe to a multi-billion-dollar contract. If I'm if I'm building a massive organization and I don't really have any sort of legal experience, then of course I'm going to get a lawyer and he's going to help me out with it. So there's all sorts of vagaries in there, and I think the root here that we need to focus on is that contracts can be as simple as a verbal agreement, and they can certainly be as complex as a multi-million-page document, right? But they all have to involve voluntarism, right? So at the end of the day, in order to make a contract truly valid morally, you have to ensure that both parties agree to that contract, voluntarily enter that contract, and to the extent possible, understand that contract. Now, that part there is where I think the crux of his argument, the crux of some of this article is going to kind of be the most controversial, is the sense that, in the world of algorithms, in the world of math, and this decentralized world we're building, there is no vagaries, right? There is some vagaries in the sense that an individual may not fully understand the math behind the system, but they can see that it performs. They can see the outputs. They can see its results. They can take on a level of risk. And then that level of risk is understandably voluntary. If you have a higher risk tolerance and you may not fully understand what's going on underneath the facade of a Bitcoin wallet, then you're choosing your own level of risk, and you're going into that contract of using that software voluntarily under the terms in which that software is provided, which is that it may or may not work, and you base it based on experience. Same thing with a car or a truck or whatever. You have confidence that that vendor is going to provide that. Currently, you have some legal recourse. There's a lot of gray areas there, right? And the reality is, as we start to build these systems, these decentralized systems that do just one thing, it's going to be really simple to measure performance. It's going to be really simple to understand what that service is all about and what it's providing you, and choose your level of risk that is okay to you, right? That's acceptable, and then therefore you can rationally know that going into that contract by using that piece of software is voluntary, and that you have minimal risk, right? Or you've chosen to accept that risk. So then there's nothing to litigate. There's nothing to conflict. There's no complexity, no vagaries, no changing of opinions, no misunderstanding of what it means, etc. Right? So anyway, the whole point here is I want to make sure that a contract is a contract. It means whatever it means between you and someone else. Now, just because common law and legal precedents and all this sort of stuff has started to kind of refine what that means in the current world, doesn't change what it functionally means intrinsically if you basically define the worst case scenario and the best case scenario. Like if you use scientific method or really the Socratic method to understand what a contract means, then it's no more simple or no more complex than just an agreement between two parties that's voluntarily engaged upon, right? So anyway, the whole point is trying to bring up things that are sophistic, like 7-year-olds and complexity of current law, is completely irrelevant. It just doesn't matter in the future paradigm of way we build service-oriented, decentralized technologies that really become microservices, right? And we'll kind of go more on that. All right. So the next thing he goes into is, it may be easier to breach a contract than to create one, which is being on both sides. That's very true, ironically. Failing to perform is one way through all failures, though all failures aren't breaches. I thought this was actually really good. Yeah, obviously this is a really good point to kind of get across. A lot of people don't understand that there's a lot of failures, and he goes into this deeper, but there's a lot of failures of contracts based on misconceptions. So having been, again, on both sides of contracts, both an enterprise buyer that spent millions and millions of dollars on contracts, and also the producer, the vendor, providing multi-million-dollar services and products to my clients, I understand how complex this can get, right? And how much of a pain this can be to write the contracts, and oftentimes there's just so much work to reinforce what he's saying, to try to define these things logically, and then there's so much that goes into potential performance clauses, and you try to build an escape clause in there on both sides. Someone tries to build on the consumer side, or the client side, they try to build an escape clause, so just in case they don't like you later on, they can exit the contract. You always try to build some sort of risk mitigation clause, like people have to pay up early or pay in half in the beginning of the performance of the contract, etc. So there's all sorts of stuff that goes on, and it's just a bunch of machinations for no reason. It's just a mess. When back to his original point, is if they like you, then you're going to be successful. You're going to get paid as a vendor, and vice versa. And if the person who's buying your services, even in an enterprise, as an enterprise buyer, even though there's other people involved, if you're the lead sponsor and they like you, you're doing pretty good, right? So it's just one of those things. It does come down to human relationships, and that's always been the key. But in the future, that isn't true. That just isn't true. Like, I don't have to trust Satoshi Nakamoto. I don't have to trust the Bitcoin Foundation. I don't have to trust Bitcoin in of itself. If I don't like it, I fork it and I go somewhere else. Like, it's just that simple. The way the technology is being built, you don't need trust. And going back to the original Bitcoin paper, that's really the point. The point is we're building microservices that eliminate the need for trust by inherently making the software and the algorithms trustless, in the sense that they're math and they are immutable and they do what they are supposed to do, right? And that's why consensus was built into Bitcoin, so that like the tertiary impacts of his application, subsequent nodes interpreting the data and what's going on in the blockchain became immutable, right? Because it required the previous block in the chain, etc. We'll go into consensus in another video, but the whole point is basically the reason why it was built that way is so that there is an intrinsic and kind of this intrinsic notion that the algorithm is the trust, and since it's math that's immutable, there is no need for trust, right? It's all gone, and that's kind of the point of this whole thing. And I think it's what he misses, or at least he tries to brush off as he gets into more as he says he goes into more complex arrangements, right? And we'll get into those kind of complex arrangements in a second and start with his comments, right? And so, going down this article, that's really, I guess the next one he goes into is really complex obligations. These complex obligations, as he says, these more complex contracts, things are like multiple vendors, multitude of services, potential tertiary impacts from all sorts of existing law and all these other things. So he goes into, and another problem is that people don't always know what they want, and what they want may change. Misunderstandings may lead to litigation as often as malice. So what he's saying is just most contracts, and this is true for most contracts, when they do go to some form of litigation or potentially arbitration, it's really because they just misunderstood each other, right? It's just human beings. We're not fully understanding each other. We say one thing, we understand it in our head, and then the other person's trying to interpret what we say. That's why we have the written language, right? We've been trying to codify these things for so long and be very specific about it, but the meaning of a particular sentence could go at least two ways, if not, a bunch, a multitude of ways. And so there's never a perfect contract. It just doesn't exist. It's a red herring. And again, it's yet another reason why we should be building decentralized smart contracts or decentralized systems that generally enable smart contracts, because you already know for sure what the system's going to do. There is no variability in the sentence, because the sentence becomes expressed as software, and the software does what it does, right? And so you can see the end output of what that sentence meant in that smart contract, and it's only going to do the one thing it does. Now, it may be wrong from what you originally wanted it to do, but then you just fork it and you move along, right? You change the software, and then it goes and does what you want. So the beauty of software is it has the action component to it, right? So when you're building an understanding between you and another human being, you have a concept, you have a firmer definition, which is still conceptual. It's between two people, and hopefully they interpret the same language as they do, which is why we have English. It's why English is pretty much the way that contracts are written all across the planet. Even if you have it in another language, it's rewritten in English because it's the most literal language that we have today anyway, outside of software, right? And so the reason why that's all important is the final component you discover later. Like you're like, okay, well, I kind of understand the services that you're providing, understand what I want, and yeah, we're going to go after this. We're going to build a project. We're going to execute. We're going to accomplish a bunch of things. And at the end, you're like, oh my God, I just built something completely different than what I originally envisioned. And so, software on the end has the kind of the end result already in front of your face really quickly. So when you build a piece of software, you can actually test the result. It's very scientific, right? So you can actually say, hey, this sentence to me translated in code means this, and then I see the output, and poof, all of a sudden I know whether it's performing to my expectations or not, right? And so that's the key distinction here. There is no ambiguity. It's either you agree or you disagree, and if you disagree with the software, then you just go to another piece of software, you write your own or whatever. So all this stuff about malice and all this stuff about litigation or ambiguity in general wrapped around litigation all dissolves, all goes away. It's no longer relevant, right? So we don't need this big construct of lawyers and the law apparatus and all this stuff for most things. I mean, there's still going to be some stuff that's interpersonal, right? But for as far as it's related to smart contracts and decentralization, it's just a matter of driving towards a microservice that only does one thing, does it really well, and then your macro umbrella service, let's say you're the DAO and you're trying to do a bunch of different things, you're going to hire all these microservices over time. Now, it's not all built yet, right? Obviously, we're going to be building as we go along. But the idea is that all these microservices, they're immutable. They don't fail. Generally, they're not going to fail your expectations. They're going to do as you expect based on your level of risk. And they're going to perform by producing output that you can measure and you can quantify and you can see. And so there is no misunderstanding a piece of software. The software just does what it does. And I think that's the key point, right? And I think all of his points kind of go back to his understanding of people and the way we interact today, but I don't think he quite gets that it's irrelevant in the future, right? So the next key kind of topic that he brings up, he made some Borg references, which was pretty funny. But anyway, the next major topic you brought up was let's quote this, there are clearly some people in the blockchain and Bitcoin world whose involvement in a platform are intended to signal a high amount of trust because they are assumed to know the right thing, TRT, what that is, right? Saying that they are trustworthy or have a good reputation suggests that they are honorable, will do what they say, and have a high TRT. At that moment, or at the moment, there aren't lots of standards that allow you to validate this externally. And this sentence, I'll finish it. Figuring out what or who or what to trust requires a lot of discretion and a lot of knowledge. No, not at all. like it doesn't at all. Like, you don't need to know who's involved with Bitcoin to see that Bitcoin works. You can move money back and forth. You can go test it right now. You can go download a wallet. You can, go buy some Bitcoin on an exchange. You can send it between two parties. The trust is in the pudding, right? The proof is in the pudding. It's true. It's provable. It's functional. You can test it. There is no TRT, who's doing the right thing. That's bullshit. I just test the software and it works. And so I think there's this misconception that he thinks that maybe on the long tail, like over time, that the people running Bitcoin are potentially at risk. And so you got to make sure that the right people run it, and that, they're not going to change the software to devalue what your currency is, all these other kind of arguments that come up in the Bitcoin space around management and organization and the fact we have none or whatever. No, you fork the software. You don't like what's going on. It's all open source. You fork the software and you go do what you damn please. I mean, that's just all there is to it. And someone else is going to agree with you. And if no one else agrees with you, then it's not an actionable business anyway. Like, if you're the only one who wants to fork Bitcoin, and you're going to try to fork Bitcoin, and no one else is going to be on the receiving end of you transmitting Bitcoin, your version 1.0, then it has no value in the marketplace. It's just reality. Like, just because I like the color blue and someone likes the color black doesn't mean like the blue, color blue should be ubiquitous and everybody should follow the color blue. It's just retarded, right? So the whole point here is that no, there is no trust. You don't need trust. You just go test it. You play with it. You test it. You see it. This is actually, I think this goes back to a very a very big issue, which I don't want to get into in depth, but basically wrapped around how people as children have been like destroyed from this from both abuse, but really the end result of this is that we have a lack of interest in exploration. And so you have a whole society of people who are just like, I'm afraid because 5 billion people didn't agree that this thing is the greatest thing since sliced bread, and they don't have $1 billion buying them, and they don't have all this. It's this old dynamic of, enterprise trust versus kind of the scruffy dude on the side of the road selling you something. There's this expectation that these corporations and all these big entities with all this trust and the right people and everything else is going to make things better, and it's going to provide reliability. And maybe in the past it did. There might be some valid arguments there, but the reality is that in the future, or even today, it is all about what you can test. It's about you exploring, about you going out and taking the risk to see what's out there, see what's functional, see how it works, judge your level of risk and your interest in something based on exploration. Go try it. The simplest way to prove that anything works is to try the functionality and see if it aligns with what you expect. If it doesn't, go somewhere else, right? Go to Litecoin, go to, Dogecoin, whatever. It doesn't matter. Go wherever you want. So the whole point is no, it's not about the right people doing the right thing. It's about you testing your expectation and adapting to the other free software or the other freely available software, or, regardless of cost. It's more about the freedom of the software to the other piece of software. And even if there is no free solution, well, then you keep using your dollars, right, in the example of currency. And this could be applied to any industry. It's like, well, do you trust Uber or do you trust a yellow cab? Like, I still know people that use yellow cab, whatever, they feel like they have a trust in the brand. They use it. That's their choice. But you don't need to guarantee that the people running Uber are wonderful and great, even in that ecosystem, which isn't fully decentralized. You just have to agree that that price for that ride is what you're looking for. And that's it. And you can test it. Now, when you get to decentralized software, it's even better because there is no humans necessarily involved in the current running version. So head or whatever the main version is, that's the main net, right, that's running live. There is no humans involved in that. There's no business operations. It's just operating based on its protocol. So you don't have to worry, like in the scenario of Uber, where, okay, maybe they're jacking up the price, overnight, or they're jacking up the price at high peak hours, and you have some concerns there. It just does what it does. So anyway, I think that's really the crux of the argument, is this kind of concept of you have to trust humans. And you really don't. Again, that's the whole point Satoshi Nakamoto was making. That's the whole point of all these pieces of software that we've been building over a period of time. Is it's all about the math. It just is what it is. And if you don't like it, go somewhere else. Right? It's that simple. There's nothing to litigate. So his next comment, he goes, but while you can try to move trust from transactions to platforms, the trust remains. And this is another piece of sophistry. And you guys will probably find that one of my major pet peeves is sophistry, and this is a glaring example. And I know some of this may sound kind of negative. Honestly, it's really not. It's just I want to move the conversation forward, and I do call sophistry out when it happens. And this is a kind of a pretty bad example of sophistry. And it's not picking on Stefan Pele or anything of that. It's just that people have been programmed to kind of be sophistic, because if they can attach science or an emotional concept to their ideas, then somehow it reinforces their ideas without actually being right. Right? So it's just something that people have been programmed to do in this brainwashing world we currently live in, and it does really piss me off. I'm not saying he's doing it on purpose. Like, people just do this subconsciously. But anyway, here's the comment. He goes, but while you can try to move trust from transactions to platform, the need for trust still remains, right? Like I just said. And then he goes in, this is an example of the first law of thermodynamics in action. And basically, first law of thermodynamics is, and we'll actually link it as well, just so you guys can go read it. But, it's basically that all atoms are immutable, and of course, we can go down to quirks and things like that. But the whole idea is that basically the things that make the world are immutable. They can either be completely eliminated, or they cannot be created net new. So we can't go in and create basically a new atom, right? That's the whole basic concept. And I won't get into string theory and all this other stuff right now. That's a whole other geeky topic someday, and I don't think it's really relevant. But anyway, the whole point is that you can't create something new and you can't take it away, right? That's a whole atomic principle. And again, this is the first law of thermodynamics. And he's trying to say that trust just never goes away. There's no way it can go away. It's just always going to be. It always has. It always will be. And it's physics. And oh my God, is that the most irrational thing I've probably heard in this whole article? But the whole point is trying to link your concept to thermodynamics is completely inaccurate. So here's why, right? So first off, trust, as I just proved earlier with the Bitcoin example, where you don't have to have any trust. You can just test the software, see what happens, and then you can decide whether or not it's basically it's at the level of risk that you're willing to accept. So that doesn't mean you have to trust it. It just means you have to see the results, right? And then over time, as a human concept, you may trust it, but it's not that it needs to be trusted. So the software and the protocol and math and all this stuff, it doesn't care whether you trust it. The software doesn't matter. It doesn't, obviously the software and the people who wrote it don't care whether you trust it or not. The reality is that it's immutable and it has no trust because it just is. So if you want to trust math, because it always is math, as a human being, you can make that decision, yes. But trust in a piece of software, in the sense of I have to trust the other people involved in the software, is just a bunch of malarkey. It doesn't really matter. Again, if you can test the results, then they're just proven fact, yes or no, right? So again, I think that's really the crux of it. We'll go on one more comment here. Let's see, the last kind of one he goes into is blockchain-based platforms become easier to trust if they acknowledge that the need for trust abides and acknowledge where it lives. So basically saying blockchain platforms or peer-to-peer platforms, or anything that's kind of written in this ecosystem is easier to trust if you acknowledge that trust is necessary, and that where that trust lives, in the sense of he's referring to the people who run it, to develop it, etc. So then he goes into centuries of contract law may provide some useful lessons. The technology may be new, but if history is any guide, all of this happened before, and all of it will be happening. That's it's true. I mean, that particular part is basically true in the sense of everything that's happened before is happening again, in the sense of we're constantly iterating on things, we're constantly building on first principles and everything else. So yeah, I mean, he's kind of linking a pretty obvious concept to his first sentence, which is really, I would say it's an opinion, and probably not a very good opinion at that, but it's still an opinion, and he doesn't provide any evidence for it, right? So his evidence is just, saying blockchain-based platforms become easier to trust if they acknowledge that the need for trust abides and acknowledge where it lives. And then he goes into some random abstract concept of things that always were, will be, blah, 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 right? So this article, good article to understand the thought processes of kind of probably the most intelligent man in law/crypto, right? Someone who understands both worlds. And he is bright, for sure, based on what I've read. I just think it's unfortunate he still kind of gets some things wrong, in the sense that he's still applying kind of his bias and his old world understanding to new principles and new ways of doing business, new ways of building technology, and thus ultimately building contracts, and thus eliminating law, which is probably the real reason why he's trying to slow the death spiral. But the reality is dispute resolution long term, which is what this turns into, most of that is eliminated by smart contracts. Like the last bastion of dispute resolution, which is kind of the function of law, or is the function of law, outside of the fact that some people use it just to exert their violence, a whole other issue. I won't go into the whole government topic, but the basic core reason why most people want law is dispute resolution, so that, you know, we can get real answers without emotion, without bias, without he said, she said, right? So, but that won't exist long tail, or even in some cases immediately, in the crypto decentralized world. It's only when you interact with another human being in person that ambiguities could arise, right? And that's where I do feel law or something like it, like dispute resolution, are still necessary. So like somebody trespasses on your property. Did they trespass, or did they do it knowingly, unknowingly, whatever? Is that an issue? Is it not? If it is an issue for you, you know, yeah, let's leverage dispute resolution or to solve those issues, right? Let's identify what actually happened in the physical world. But law is a physical world scenario service, right? So it's in this world where something happened between two parties, and we didn't have software to prove that it did or didn't happen, right? So, I mean, that's really all that law is about. And now that we have software that's immutable, and we have math that we can turn into robust algorithms that are just unbreakable, unchangeable, infallible, there is no need for these traditional systems. And I think there's a group of people still fighting for, you know, their existence. And there's this whole concept called racing to the bottom in business, where basically, if you're in a traditional industry, let's say taxis, for instance, and you're getting displaced by Uber, you're trying to evolve your solutions as fast as possible, even though your business model is still fundamentally the same. You're trying to make minor tweaks here and there to try to help save your business for as long as possible and make revenue for as long as possible. And that's the race to the bottom, right? They're eventually going to die, and they're eventually going to go away. And you're just going through the machinations to get to the bottom. When what you should be doing is changing your damn business model, right? So anyway, so kind of the whole point here is that the future of law, as we know it, turns into true dispute resolution. Sorry, fat finger here. True dispute resolution, and also just microservices, right? So microservices that do one thing, they do it really well, and that's all they do. How do you prove that they do it? Because they work, right? You can put an input into the piece of software, and you get the expected output. And if you don't get the expected output, you go to the other microservice that does, right? It's as simple as that. So anyway, that's the future of where organizations are going. That's the future of where contracts are going. That's the future of where you know, all these decentralized services are going. And there's not a lot of value in our traditional legal system anymore. And so we've got to see where that value remains in the future. But I would recommend that people who are interested in the concepts of law start to move into dispute resolution around physical things, and stop wasting your time in contracts. So anyway, thank you guys very much. I'd love to hear your feedback. Feel free to comment below. Let me know your thoughts, and I'll actually reach out to Stefan Paley and see if we can get, you know, him on the show and maybe do an interview with him. And I'd love to hear his thoughts, and see if we can have a kind of a discussion that goes back and forth on these. So thanks everyone. I appreciate it, and we'll be talking soon.